You're listening to Conversations with Shonda, a podcast that unpacks the community's grittiest, most vexing problems, hosted by Shonda Smith Baker.
Pierre, thank you for being in this conversation with me. This is Shonda Smith Baker, and this is Conversations with Shonda.
It's lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Awesome. Well, before we get started, I would love it if you would provide a brief introduction of yourself to our listeners.
Sure. I'm Pierre Berastaín. I am currently the regional director for CPI Center for Public Impact North America. At a personal level, I'm an immigrant. I say that I'm a gay, previously undocumented Latino immigrant in the United States who also has the privilege of being highly educated, but hopefully still connected to community in multiple ways. I have a background in gender-based violence at the intersection of disability, of immigrant rights, LGBTQ identities. And right now, the Center for Public Impact, we have a mission to reimagine government so that it works for everyone, which is quite a bold mission in that we see a lot of actors right now reimagining government. And I think that our vision might be a little bit different than how it's being reimagined. But the mission itself assumes, I think, that government can be the answer to a lot of our problems, right? So it's bold in that way that in a way we still have some faith in that government can be effective and efficient for people.
You said that you had the privilege of education. Can you talk about how you see that from your lens, particularly with the identities that you just laid out for us?
I have the privilege of education in terms of I went to Harvard for both my bachelor's degree and then my master's. I worked at Harvard as the director of the Office of Sexual Assault Prevention and Response. And then I got my doctorates at one of the best schools of public health, right? The UNC Gilling School of Public Health. So I'm highly educated. I think I can say that. And it's something, to be honest, that I'm still grappling with in that I don't like to be called doctor, for example, but I have a lot of my Latino community that says, Pierre, there are only 2% of doctorates who are Latinos. And, they kind of push me to become comfortable. And even as I say it right now, I get a little warm and a little kind of red, right? Because the other side, the other side of why I say I am deeply educated is that I was nurtured by a strong group of Latino folks. My community, my family, right? I was raised by aunts and uncles and older cousins and my parents and grandparents, right? And they always kept me, I think, quite grounded in community and in the realities of what it meant to be a young gay Peruvian boy. I mean, I don't think they knew I was gay then. They had their inklings, but they taught me to be resilient and strong and not take things for granted. And I remember that I always kind of scorned those who were highly educated and those who had doctorates, because all a doctorate means is that you went in and you studied some community of color and got all the wisdom, and then you put it in a book. You had the privilege of studying for 5 years, 7 years, put it in a book, and then that and claimed it as your own. And this is kind of why I resisted. I resisted pursuing a doctorate degree myself. But I think it's that kind of juxtaposition or that kind of combination of being grounded in community and being able to also be in the academic circles, the ivory towers of academia in the United States, that I guess somewhat humbly I could say has given me a perspective in terms of code switching and navigating between really corporate professional worlds and the tribulations and elements of the communities that I care about so much.
The reason why I want to pull it out is because we know that there are people who travel through education in a way that is just assumed and very regular to their experience. Mm. And then there are those of us that look at that experience in a similar way, right? Like, you have a privilege of doing it because you need money, you need connections often to get that access. And so I think it's important because many people are traveling educational journeys, really wrestling with emotions. What does it mean for them? Are they abandoning their community? Once they get there, how do they use it? And I think the more folks with those advanced degrees from those places sort of talk about what they wrestle through, I think it provides an opening for those that might be sitting on the fence.
I was one of the first undocumented students to go to Harvard, and I was incredibly thankful that I had that opportunity and that I had a scholarship. And at the same time, I remember grappling with mental health challenges, right? With the anxiety of not knowing what was going to happen after graduation. And I tell the story that I remember my senior year in college, I was just laying on my bed looking up at the ceiling and looked out the window. And the first thought that came to mind was, I think I know what it feels to feel like it would be best to just jump out that window. And that was the moment that I realized I was having suicidal thoughts. And of course, I didn't carry through with any of those actions that went through my mind. But that to me just illustrates, right, that a lot of our communities, to your point, go through these educational journeys, and on top of that are carrying an emotional baggage, if you will, or emotional backpacks that make that journey a little bit more difficult, but worth it nonetheless. And it is when I had those moments, and that's just one of the many, it's when I had those moments that I relied so much on my community, my family, my friends, and community becomes ever so more important as an act of resilience and resistance, I think, through as you go through your educational journey.
Yeah. What did it mean for you to be one of the first undocumented students there? Did it feel like an additional weight or an obligation,
Right.
or what was it isolating? Like, I mean, what was that for you?
I think I had the blessing of not knowing that I was one of the first ones until later on. And the reason that I say that is that the university was so ill prepared to support undocumented students, right? And this is when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We had started as a university diversifying efforts in which we said, there are smart and brilliant undocumented students. Let's accept them in. But they had not built the infrastructure, the systems, the support that would allow those students to succeed, right? And I remember challenging the administration and the deans at the time around how to support undocumented students, and many other undocumented students were independently doing the same. And by the time that my senior year came around, they had formed a little bit of a task force, a committee to figure out, what do we do with them? What do undocumented students need? And one of the things that they did, that's the first step, was put us in touch with others who were, quote unquote, like us. And that was the first time, right? Not senior year, junior year. That was the first time that that I had kind of known of any other undocumented students at all. And I got an email from a really close friend of mine who just wrote, "Y tú también, no?" Meaning, you too, huh? Like you're also in this, huh? And that friend is Carla Cornejo Villavicencio, who wrote the book Undocumented Americans and just published her other novel, Catalina. And that began a beautiful friendship of supporting each other, and realizing then, by that kind of small act from the administration of putting us, the undocumented students, in touch, and realizing that, like, wait a second, we are, like, these folks haven't dealt with undocumented folks before, really. And they're learning literally from the ground up as to, like, what it even means. So yeah, that's why I said, like, I think I had the blessing of not knowing that I was one of them, so I didn't feel the pressure. I just kind of did my own thing. Yeah.
Well, you brought up DEI, and that was the route I was headed down, and I think trying to contextualize it to the lives.
Lord.
I know, Lord, what do you got to say about what's happening with DEI right now?
What do I have to say with what's happening? If I can posit this answer, not in DEI, but in what's happening, I think, in our country. And I deeply, deeply fear for the future of our country under the influence of what could become authoritarianism and fascism. And I think that history has shown that sometimes people only recognize the dangers of those regimes when they experience the consequences firsthand, when their rights, security, livelihoods are directly impacted. And don't get me wrong, I do not wish suffering on anyone. I do believe that for some, though, only a profound wake-up call will make them see the full extent of the damage that is being done. And it's a painful reality, I think, that societal change often comes through hardship. But I hope that it leads to a collective realization before it's too late. And the problem with this, as I say it, of course, is that others end up suffering too, especially those who are already marginalized, right? And at the same time, our communities have, for a very long time, known how to endure and survive the long-standing systems of injustice and oppression, right? We have always fought, we have always resisted, and built in the face of oppression, and we'll continue to do so. So the question is, for me, whether others are finally going to recognize the stakes before even more damage is done. Those are my thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are you getting a sense that people are or will?
I don't know. I think it's too early to tell. I think some people are having a bucket of cold water thrown on their faces, on their heads, and feeling like the floor is being removed from underneath them. So some folks are. The question is whether a critical number, whether a critical mass will come to that realization. And for our sake, I hope the answer is yes.
Yeah, well, you have, or let me ask it this way, how important is storytelling or narrative shifting to people coming into that recognition, right? Because we do sit, similar to you, sitting there on campus, and you're going through your experience and you think that you're sort of alone in it, and you just make a connection differently that have you understand that life is different once those pieces come together. And so how important is narrative change, storytelling, truth telling? Like what value? It feels like the stakes for me feel like they're higher and even more important now for us to both tell our collective stories, but individual stories.
Right. Yeah. I think storytelling, and I love storytelling, but not that I'm really good at it, actually. Like when I look at my mother and my aunts and the way they tell stories, it's just like you're watching a movie right in front of you. But I think storytelling is essential to systems change, because data alone doesn't shift mindsets. Stories do. And systems are made up of people, and people make decisions based on emotions, experiences, and narratives just as much as they do with logic. So a well-told story puts a human face on systemic issues, making really abstract problems more tangible. I think stories build empathy, they create urgency, they help people see themselves in the change. And that's why movements that succeed, whether in public health or immigration reform, gender-based violence prevention, et cetera, right? Those movements aren't just backed by research, they're driven by compelling deeply personal narratives that change hearts before they change policies. But I will say that storytelling is not just about individual anecdotes. I think we are often exposed to just individual anecdotes, and we think that that's what storytelling is. I think storytelling is about connecting stories to structures, showing how a single person's experience is not an exception, but a pattern. It's a microcosm of a pattern, right? And when stories highlight systemic failures and point towards solutions, they move from being just narratives to becoming tools of transformation. So I think, in short, if you want systems change, you need both strategy and story. One shapes the policy, the other fuels the movement.
Yeah. One of the stories that are being told is around undocumented people in this country. And there are many stories of undocumented people in this country. How do we know where to go? How do we know where to find the facts? How do we think through that as we are being told of the danger of these people coming into our country?
You know, it's interesting about the stories we tell and for what purpose. Hannah Arendt, not Hannah Arendt, I am thinking of Joan Didion, who says, we tell stories in order to live. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. And I've gone back to that sentiment, Joan Didion being the author, of course. I go back to that sentiment because I wondered what stories or what is the reason that we're telling these stories? What are we trying? What is the story that we're trying to tell ourselves in order to live, right, as a society? And I think it's really easy to scapegoat immigrants or the LGBTQ community, other marginalized communities, because it shields us from grappling with much more real, urgent fire alarms that we have in front of us, right? Gun violence, maternal deaths, right? Child literacy or illiteracy, child malnutrition, food deserts. I mean, these are the issues that are breaking our country apart. But it's easier to make a distraction and say, focus on one of the groups that has some of the lowest rates of criminal activity, immigrants, right? It's much easier to do that because if I can create that fear in you enough, you might forget about the price of your eggs, the fact that measles is going rampant, the fact that water is polluted in different parts of the United States, transportation is inefficient, infrastructure is crumbling, right? I can make you forget that if I make you fear something. So if we want to remain just oblivious to what's happening and what's really coming, you know, the impending chaos, then it's easy to buy those stories.
Yeah, and you're doing work to think about what government can be at its most aspirational place. Is that a good way of describing it?
That is. It's not easy, right? But it is. I think, yeah. How can government be agents of change and inspiration? Yeah, I tell the story of the city of Denver, the mayor of Denver, who he tells the story better than I ever could, but he essentially was getting calls from every part of the, both sides of the aisle, Democrats, Republicans, business owners, CEOs in Denver who said, Mike, we have all of these immigrants in the city who have been bused from Texas, right, to Denver and among other jurisdictions. And like, we need labor. Like, we truly need folks. We're having a hard time finding skilled workers. What can be done? And one of the things that Mike Johnson's administration realized is, right now, if you were to put in your asylum case, file for asylum, your next court date will be in 7 to 9 years. And in that meantime, you have no work permit, nothing. And so you're just kind of sitting there waiting, if you will. But if a lawyer proactively puts in your application, and the system is a little bit more complex, but if we work with lawyers to put in your application, you can get a work permit in 6 months. So what did the Denver administration do? Mike's administration was they got in an army of pro bono lawyers, volunteer lawyers, to start helping immigrants process those cases. And while they waited, right, while they waited for their work permit to come 6 months later, they stood up a training program, a skill-up program based on the skills that these companies said that they needed. And then you started matching immigrants with new skills to businesses. And I think that is one amazing example of how government can be an engine of change and hope and effective governance rather than deflecting responsibility.
Yeah. So there's another side of this. So there's the side that is sort of fear-based. And then I would say, I mean, there's probably many sides, but as you're talking, I'm thinking about even my own background as an African American person who historically we had to fight for our right to vote. It was very dangerous to be able to do so. They had poll tax. There were all these ways in which we were discouraged through example of death of other people or through employment, inability to get employment, all kinds of harassing behaviors that have happened. And so then you have people that say government was just never for us, right? What would you say to those folks? Because we have, I had a guest on here, Ruth Richardson, and she said if didn't vote was on the ballot, it would win every time. Right. So this is really for the didn't vote audience, like that have just been discouraged, disgusted, maybe haven't had a family history of engaging in this way. Any perspective that you could provide on for that group?
I would say you're absolutely right to feel that way because history backs it up, right? The government hasn't always worked for everyone. And in many cases, it has actively oppressed communities, Black communities, Indigenous communities, immigrants. We can just go down the list. And so the skepticism isn't just understandable. I think it's rational, right? But here's the thing. When systems don't work for us, we have two choices. Either we disengage and leave power in the hands of those who created the problem, or we push our way in and reshape those systems ourselves. And history shows that every major civil rights victory, voting rights, labor rights, and again, I can, disability rights movement, right? They come not from waiting for the government to change, but from the people demanding that it change. And I think about folks like Fannie Lou Hamer, right, who was brutalized for just trying to register to vote, to your point, right, but still kept organizing. I think about the leaders of the Reconstruction era. I think about Dolores Huerta, right? The folks in the Reconstruction era who, despite everything, are building schools, right? They held office, created institutions that still shape Black communities today, right? And government wasn't designed for them either, but they fought to make it work for their folks, for our community. So I'd say the system may not have been built for us, but that's exactly why we have to be in it. Not because we believe in some fairy tale about government, but because every time we've stepped up, we have forced government to change. And so part of what CPI does is we very strongly believe that change, systems change or government change cannot happen without the direct involvement of those most affected. And so when we take projects in partnership with governments, we say, how is the community involved? We have had so many, examples in which government might have come in with a solution in mind and says, this is what, here is the problem. We've identified it. Here is the solution. I'm not even going to go into an example right now, but here's what we're going to propose to do. And then we take it to the community, and the community tears it apart and says, absolutely not. And more, to the credit of the partners we've worked with in different city governments, they've said, humbly, we were wrong. Mm. It will be much better whenever we partner with community, and the community helps us through a human-centered design way come up with solutions that actually will be effective for them. And those are kind of some of the tools that we bring to the table: systems change, human-centered design, right? Participatory action research that turns or puts the power back in the hands of community to shape the government that they want. That's easier done, I'll just say, at the local level, right? Yeah. And so that's part of the reason we concentrate a lot on state and local governments as well.
What do you see the opportunity in the moment is? I asked the question on DEI because that is the question that comes up the most right now. People being very worried about use of language, action, the lack of funding, and we can talk about that. But I do think that out of that fear, perhaps we're not looking at it wide enough in terms of what is the opportunity. That is a response. But I think that there also could be different actions that allow us to sort of establish our own authority and agency in a moment like this. What do you see are opportunities?
You mentioned the challenges, so I won't, we can go more into it as you mentioned. I mean, there are policy reversals, there are funding cuts, right? The stripping of the social safety net. And that's disconcerting. And I do think that there are opportunities for grassroots mobilization, for example, right? So that the reduction in institutional support for DEI can galvanize grassroots movements to advocate for equity and inclusion. And communities have been doing that for ages, for decades, for centuries, right? And communities can organize locally to address systemic issues and foster resilience and reliance. I think the problem is that we haven't done a really good job as a system to build the capacity of grassroots to do real systems thinking, systems analysis, systems change, right? And as someone whose organization and whose work and research is on systems change and who has worked in grassroots and in community, the way that a lot of the times we define systems change in grassroots mobilization really wasn't systems change, right? And so we haven't really empowered our communities with the tools of really pulling the levers of systems to make ripple effects and lasting change. The other opportunity for me is innovative partnerships, right? And organizations may seek alternative funding models and collaborations, right? Partnering with local businesses, philanthropic entities, right? I think that's really important whenever we're seeing the stripping of funding and just the stripping of the social safety net. And I worry about that because we already didn't have a good safety net in the United States for many folks. And we held an event in New York last week with a number of organizations working in the space of gender-based violence. And one of them literally just had $500,000 cut from a funder who was a private funder, but they had been impacted by the fires on the West Coast, right? Their lives had changed. So talk about how climate change ends up impacting a person's life who was donating $500,000 to this organization. And suddenly now survivors of domestic violence don't have housing. We have to lay off, 8 people. There are ripple effects. And so I just went on a tangent there, but my point is that when we're talking about innovative partnerships and opportunities, even small businesses, small philanthropy can step up in localized philanthropy. So those are some of the opportunities that I see. I mean, I can go on, but I'll stop there for now.
No, I think that's good. And one of the podcasts that I just did talked a little bit about systems change and really the distinction between response, right? Investment in response, particularly from a philanthropic point of view, right? Response, programmatic investment, and then systems change. And you said that there's been sort of inadequate sort of support in that space, which I totally agree with you in terms of what we need to really continue to build the ground for systems change. So in your experience, one is, do you think that philanthropists and foundations have a real grasp on what that is and what it takes?
Who do they have a real grasp? I mean, that's a bold question.
Let's just say, meaning that you're not speaking to all of your funders. I get that, but in a very general sense, do you think that there's more work in informing them, right? Because I know that it's not everyone. Of course, there are some, but in a general sense, do you think there's a handle on what that is?
Yeah, no, I do have an answer. So I was just trying to formulate it. I mean, I'd say that philanthropy and foundations often struggle with a distinction between investment and response, especially when it comes to systems change, right? The investment and response, it gets conflated all the time. And most funding goes towards programmatic responses, right? Funding shelters, direct services, crisis intervention, right? And these are necessary, don't get me wrong, especially now, they're necessary. When you're in a crisis, you need the ambulance, right? But they don't shift the conditions that create the crisis in the first place. So investment in systems change means funding long-term strategies that reshape policies and structures and power dynamics. And sometimes philanthropy resists this because it's messy and slow, and it doesn't show quick results, measurable quick wins, right? It doesn't. And so in my experience, many funders talk about systems change, but few truly understand what it takes. It's not just about scaling up an existing program. And oftentimes you'll see an RFP that says, if you have an idea, we're funding you to scale up. And they'll think that systems change is that, hey, if we're funding you to scale up a program, we hit it. And it's not, right? It's not about adding another grant cycle either. It's about funding power building, about funding policy advocacy, movement infrastructure. That's sorely, sorely needed especially in the gender-based violence field, for example, right? So these aren't the things that get splashy reports, right, or immediate metrics, but they're really what make real, lasting impact possible. And so part of the challenge is that philanthropy itself is part of the system, and many foundations operate within the same short-term output-driven logic, right, that limits government programs. They want clear deliverables, right, short grant cycles, predictable outcomes, but systems don't work that way. They require long-term flexible funding, trust in community leadership, right? Willingness to take risks on solutions that don't fit nearly into a logic model. So, do foundations and philanthropy really grasp what it takes? Some do, right? But I don't think most really do. The ones that get it are the ones backing multi-year and restricted funding, supporting advocacy, prioritizing the leadership of those most impacted by the systems that they claim that they want to change. That's the difference between just funding programs and actually transforming systems. And I'll say one more thing, that systems change is really about mindset shifts, right? If we think about the iceberg model of systems change, shifting mindsets is the foundation of it all. And we think whenever we're funding systems change, we're like, oh, we're just going to do a 5-year program. And that's this, even a 10-year program. And I say, it takes 18 years to build an adult. And that's generous because, like, for men, we don't develop our brains fully until we're 26, right? Which explains a lot of dating issues. But if it takes 18 years to develop an adult, generally speaking, what makes you think you're going to undo that mindset, that frame of reference and way of thinking in 5 years? It takes much longer than that. And so investment in systems change is longitudinal investment.
Yeah, agreed. Gender-based violence. You mentioned that you led at Harvard on that. How did you get involved with that, and what have you learned?
How did I get involved in it? You're asking me to go personal as much as professional.
If you want to do that.
I appreciate it. My family left Peru when I was 11. And we left because Peru was going through an internal warfare through the 80s and 90s. And my family was in all parts of the socioeconomic spectrum in terms of security. We were fine, one day, and then the next day, maybe not. And then, it was tremendous instability. So when my family left, I became obsessed with understanding the reasons for that departure at a macro level. Understand, you're 11. So I mean, how much sense of the world can you really make, right? But I became obsessed since a very early age about human rights, and I started studying it for every angle possible in high school, believe it or not, and then in college, I studied it, from the film angle, from literary angles, from government and anthropology and human rights, and then I went to divinity school and I studied that as well, and one of the things that you realize is that anytime you have societal upheaval or environmental disasters, gender-based violence skyrockets, right? We saw that in COVID, gender-based violence skyrocketed, right? We see that in warfare, what's happening in Palestine, right? Israel-Palestine Gaza conflict, gender-based violence skyrockets. So it's just predictable. So that began pointing me in that direction of working in gender-based violence. And as you work, you realize then of the many people that you love who have been through some of these things, some of these issues. And I realized that my mother was a survivor of domestic violence, not from the part of my father necessarily, but from the extended family who imparted kind of emotional abuse or psychological abuse. And that kind of shows you, domestic violence has many different angles. It's not just physical. And then I myself experienced sexual abuse in college. Had a couple of experiences. And this is kind of what, from a personal level, as much as academic and professional, it just drove my passion into this particular field. And of course, my multiple identities as a gay male, right, led me to LGBTQ specific gender-based violence, right, or power-based violence, as I refer to it. Immigration, same thing, right? So I looked at the intersections, and that's what led me to that work.
I interviewed Jesse Leon. He wrote a book called Unbroken. I could not make it through his book because it felt really painful to read. And I remember saying to him that I actually felt some guilt because I didn't have to live through his experience. He was a sex worker and he experienced sexual violence as a young child. He works in the philanthropic space, and his story is he went to Harvard. He has an incredible story of strength and survival and community. But I did say to him that what I appreciated in his storytelling is that the story of sexual violence often sits primarily with women in a way that's not addressed necessarily. So I'm not saying that there's a good ending to that story, but I am saying that's where it primarily has sat, at least in my life, and that I haven't heard about it or men that are willing to come and talk about their experience, all of the things that sit with that, much less all the other identities that you're talking about. Do you think that there are some movement in that space of really talking about gender-based violence in a way that is reflective and inclusive?
No. I think you're right. I mean, both as a society and as a field, right, we don't make space for men survivors of domestic sexual violence. That's a choice. And I can think of, right, it was only in the Violence Against Women Act and FIPSA, Family Violence Prevention Services Act reauthorization in 2013 and 2014, that we ended up getting actual non-discrimination protections enshrined in the law that said you cannot deny services based on sex and gender, right? Only in the 2000s did we start saying that, right? And so we still have shelters that turn away men, that turn away trans folks, right, who are in crisis. And part of that, as I mentioned, is the field. And I think that I would get criticized by many of my colleagues for saying this, perhaps, not all of them, but that oftentimes we have the feminist movement in the United States has seen this issue, an issue that is perpetrated solely by men. And we have created this false dichotomy that if this is primarily perpetrated by men, then men must be the issue and they could never be the survivors themselves. And that's a lie we tell ourselves, right? To fragment what it means to be a survivor of domestic and sexual violence. So that's the movement societal level that we also tell men, you can't, I mean, even as something as cliche as you can't cry, you can't, deal with your emotions in a specific way. And at a personal level, that becomes insidious. And so you learn how to deal with things in a very unhealthy manner. I was talking to a cousin. I have one of my uncles right now who's quite sick and might pass away. And my cousin was telling me that, her children were being very matter of fact and saying, well, what are you worried about? You're religious. You always pray. You say God will take care of it. Like what, there's nothing to do right now. There's an operation. He'll either come out of it or not. grandpa he'll either be with us or not. Very practical ways of dealing with it. And I said, your children are doing exactly what the family has taught them. Our family deals with trauma either by joking about it, right? Making fun of it, or by being black and white, rational, right? To the point that we just bottle up our feelings and we say, here's the reality. Either this will happen or this will happen. He's either going to die or he's going to survive. And he will either have grandpa or we won't have grandpa, right? And your children are doing that exactly. I mean, amazing for them that they're doing exactly what you taught them, right? And now you're coming to me and saying, but they're not processing their emotions. That's because we haven't taught them how to do that, right? So now that's an opportunity for you as their mom to teach them how to nuance that coping and survival mechanism that we as a family have taught them.
Yeah, I don't know where I'm going in my head, but I'm knitting a couple of things together, including what you shared about the many ways in which gender-based violence shows up in the telling of the story of what both you and your mother experienced and how you got into the work, and then this story. And there are ways in which many of us, and all of us, really have discovered in terms of survival that shape our points of view. You are sitting in a space that is quite complicated, but clearly intersects with your own life and reality. And I say locally, like, proximity is great to have in the work. And it's very hard to have in the work because there's no separation between you, your family, the people you love, your community, and the work that you're doing. And so I think my question, one, is, as you do the work, I imagine, and similarly to what you've somewhat shared, but that you began to understand and connect dots backwards to your family and to your own experiences. And that can feel very heavy. So what have you done to help manage that heaviness in the work and keep you proximate in the most balanced way possible so that you can do the work?
That's such a great question because, I mean, honestly, this work is heavy, right? Like, and when you're personally invested, to your point, whether it's because of lived experience or deep commitment, it's easy to absorb the weight of the systems that you're trying to change, right? And when you're working on these issues like gender-based violence or immigration or public health inequities, you're constantly surrounded by stories of harm and injustice. And so for me, I've learned that holding space for systems change doesn't mean carrying all the pain myself. And so I think a few things have helped me navigate that, right? First, I mentioned community. And that's been a nourishing element for me. I also have what I call, what a mentor of mine called a personal board of directors. And, nonprofits, foundations have a board of directors. I have my personal board of directors who have very much aligned values with me. And they also challenge thoughtfully, and there's a mutual curiosity to how we do this work, and that is so nourishing to me. I was just actually meeting with one of them, quote unquote, as in, like, she's a friend of mine who shares tremendous values with me, but also challenged my thinking in really beautiful ways, and that was so energizing for me. The other piece that I do intentionally is create. And I have the privilege to do this, is create moments of joy. And for instance, I said to one of my friends and I, we decided to just pick up for the weekend and go to Florida and escape the the cold and just kind of have a wonderful time having some drinks and talking about life, talking about, going really dark and deep, but also like pulling out, right? And those kind of moments of letting joy and creativity kind of exist alongside the work are so important, because when you're dealing with serious issues, it's easy to let them consume you. So I try to stay connected to the things that bring me joy, whether it's storytelling or humor or traveling or, just being around people who remind you that life is not only about the struggle. Joy isn't a distraction. It's a resistance to burnout, right? And then the other piece is therapy. And especially as a male, right? Like it's really critical that that we engage in therapy. It's a mental floss for the mind. Just like we go to the dentist and clean up once in a while, right? Like just like we go to the gym, therapy becomes really important. Yeah, that's what it is for me. It's a mental floss for the mind. And through therapy is an investment in your own in making sense out of your own life and how you relate to others. And I think that's been really helpful for me, because sometimes when you're in these dark places, it's really easy to just continue and spiraling going dark. And sometimes you need a buddy, whether you pay them or not, to help you pull out of that. And that's been really helpful for me.
And you said therapy, especially for men. And, I think there's a masculinity issue that we have. And we touched on it, right, a little bit. But how does that, I think that there are things, and you said it, right? You were like, you shouldn't be crying, man up, toughen up, don't be like a little girl, like all the things that we tell our young men collectively in our communities. And then they grow up and they're like, why aren't you showing more emotion? Like, I'm trying to tap into who you are. And so there are these mixed signals. And again, just, having the permission to tell your story fully in a way that hopefully can be received regardless of who you are, what gender you are, I think is incredibly important. But you sort of put that disclaimer out there, like especially for men. And why especially for men? Is it just because of what society has taught us about bottling up men, about bottling up their emotions?
I think for me,
I grew up in a family where it's like family business stays in the house. Like, you don't be telling our business outside these doors. And so there's some of that there as well. But
me too. Yeah. I mean, family business, like, don't you dare talk about it to anybody else. For me, the more interesting thing is, why did we teach that as communities to our children? And we talk about this as toxic masculinity, right? Toxic ways of being, et cetera. And I think that's unfair, because when my mother said, you keep the business in the house, she was afraid that if I opened my mouth, we would get deported. It was a survival strategy.
Yeah,
right.
I know exactly where you're going.
You know what I mean? Like if you go and you complain about somebody else as a Black or brown child, you might get your behind taken away by Child Protective Services, right? Yeah. So it's a survival strategy. If you show too much emotion as a Black boy, you're going to get beat up. As a little brown boy, you're going to get beat up, right? If you don't bottle up your emotions with the police, what happens, right? So we teach survival strategies to our children. The problem is, and I will say that those survival strategies and tools took us through adulthood, took us to who we are now. But we can't be using those survival and resilience strategies that we learned as kids to serve us in the same way as adults. And so, just like, right, when we did PE, physical education in school, and now as adults, we go to the gym and kind of take on heavier weights to get, and we learn new skills and new exercises. Similarly, therapy is just that. It's saying, I haven't learned, and by God, I'm not going to learn all the skills and tools that I can. Why would I? Why would I think that, life is it's a lifelong educational journey. So why would I think that I've learned everything that I needed to learn, to be an adult in my first 18 years or whatever it was, right? And this is why therapy, I think, is so particularly important for men, because we think that we have the toolbox to help us through life, get through life, but we really don't, right? We only learn those tools through interactions with others. And when we bottle things up, we don't get those interactions. We had those interactions as children with our mom, with our dad, with our siblings, with our cousins, who taught us those tools. But as adults, we distance ourselves more and more sometimes from those people who can help us. So that's why I think therapy becomes so important.
Yeah. Do you have things that you've had to unlearn about your approach to leadership?
Yes, my goodness. Not just unlearn, but just kind of radically change the way I think. And I'll give you an example. And I've learned new ones, I think. So, I used to be, I think, more of a bit of a hierarchical kind of leader, right, or thought in that style of leadership. And then a lot of my Latinx community helped me realize more collective ways of leading and collective ways of involving folks and whatnot. And so I really leaned into that. And then in the last few years, I had a few younger folks, Gen Zers, who said, I don't care, right? Like what the color of the painting is in the wall. I don't care what bookshelf you buy, right? Like we really don't care. Like we are on a, we don't get paid a ton. We are on a day-to-day dealing with crisis or with people who are, who are experiencing domestic violence, and I'm trying to figure out how to help this person stay alive. And then leadership is asking me about the color of the paint, right? No, right? So that's an extreme, but that's an example of how you end up kind of adding layers to your understanding of collectivism, for instance, right? And collectivism is like, well, every decision gets made in the collective. Well, there are limits to that as well. So that's one quick example, if you will, of kind of nuancing my understanding of collective leadership and where collective leadership fails and where it needs to be balanced with kind of individual accountability and individual kind of leadership, right? So that's one piece. The other one is around burnout. And we as a society posit burnout on the individual, right? And I don't have to convince any of your listeners of this. We tell people to do yoga, to take care of themselves, to take the day off for a mental health day. And, and that just ignores the reality that there are systemic structures, organizational structures that lead to burnout. And I tell the story of a person I supervised who wanted to just quit, and I once I kind of dug into it, it was that he was burned out because he had a 300-person caseload, right? I had just come in the organization, and I was like, you have a 300 person caseload, and that's what's burning you out. And so we as an organization had to apologize for having him just hold that on his own. Right. And then I got angry then. And I was just like, I'm not going to be complicit in the exploitation of a Black man in holding 300 caseloads. Right. And so then we went to government, to the government partners, and we said, you have to increase the funding. We're only going to do this many caseloads. And the rest, you're going to have to figure it out. Right. Because then you're just getting free labor from people of color. And that was systemic, that was structural, that we had to engage the system. And then I'm happy to say that he stayed and he kind of helped us revolutionize the way that we were providing services. But as a leader, I think it's important to kind of get underneath the structural, organizational, systemic levers that lead to burnout. And that's been really helpful for me.
Yeah, I don't even know how you arrived at being able to see it as exploitation or extractionary. Because we work in a system that says we need to take care of community despite the resources. And there are many people burning out and leaving the sector, and frankly, not being able to provide good service because they're stretched so thin. And there was something that allowed you to see the issue as systemic, and then something that somehow the agency to go in and really fight for what you need. And it sounded to me like also willing to leave resources on the table if it required that. You're like,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, it's easy to ignore the systemic problem when the system is able to push the responsibility into others, whether it be community, and we exploit well-intentioned, values-driven leaders right? And we as leaders often let them exploit us by saying, oh, yeah, we got to take care of everybody. Every survivor needs to be taken. It's true. Every survivor needs to be taken care of. We do need to address every person who's experiencing homelessness. We do need to address every person who is experiencing a mental health crisis. If we do believe that as a society, you better fund it.
Yeah.
Because it's not free. And it's not free because our labor is important, but it's not free because I did an analysis. Let me just back up. I did an analysis around how much it cost to properly provide wraparound services back in 2020 with one of my old organizations, the District Alliance for Safe Housing, DASH, in Washington, D.C., that provides housing to survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And we said, it actually cost about $40,000 to $50,000 to just provide housing, wraparound supports, and all of that. And I remember some funders were just shocked and just like, what do you mean? And I said, imagine that I strip you of every single resource that you've had. Every single, you have nothing but a backpack. And now you need to pay for housing for an apartment in Washington, D.C., one of the most expensive cities in the United States. You got to pay for food. You got to pay legal fees. How much do you need? Like $50,000, $40,000 is a steal. That's nothing, right? Because how much do you need a year right now to live? And we're quibbling over 40, 50K now, right? And that's because we have this mentality of doing more with less. But here's the thing. Right now we have these federal cuts, right? When you are cutting the budget by 40%, 50%, 60%, how much tighter can you go? There was an advocate who said, if you have a belt and I cut it by 40%, there is no much more cutting you can. There is no more tightening the belt that you can do. The belt doesn't tighten anymore when it's 40% cut.
And I think even with some of the through line from where we started, from your personal story, looking out that window, to the issue on gender-based violence, the push around really wide therapy, building new tools, building new strategies to think about how we need to be as adults. And then also as leaders, I think the responsibility that we have, I think this sort of theme of reflection and growth is really coming up for me. And then there's something else really around health and wellness in this space. I know that public health has been another place of focus for you, and it's another place of conversation more loudly, and thinking about all of the ways in which we need to be thinking about how these come together and at the root of the individual, right? If you're not healthy, if you don't have healthy strategies, if you're not by healthy people, life becomes more complicated. But then we have this system of public health that doesn't seem to be keeping up with the needs, particularly for folks in marginalized communities. And so I'm wondering if you would just offer some thoughts there in terms of what we should be thinking about in terms of public health.
For marginalized communities, what should we be thinking about? My goodness. So yeah, I mean, there is a connection between how we show up as leaders and adults, how we take care of ourselves, how we build systems that actually serve people, right? It's hard to think right now in this moment of time around kind of the public health system, because we just don't invest in it. We don't put wellness and prevention first, right? Again, we invest in crisis response, and even that is crumbling. Right? We have women who need reproductive, and I'm not talking just about abortion, I'm talking about full comprehensive reproductive health, right? And we are stripping that away from 50% of the population, right? We don't have enough mental health responders, right? We have a crisis of not enough doctors and nurses and healthcare staff in general, which is what's leading to the burnout for many of these folks. I have so many friends who are doctors who have left practicing and gone to work for pharmaceutical companies or for other for doing consulting or you name it. And so we just don't invest in in prevention and well-being enough or at all, right? It's easy to invest in the ambulance. It's harder to invest in the infrastructure. So I wish that I had a good answer for you. I think part of the answer, however, is if we go back to our roots and invest in communities and community responses, and again, let communities drive the change and truly partner with community as experts, that becomes really powerful. And I think right now about the promotora model in Latin America, the health promoters model, where Latin America doesn't have the healthcare infrastructure that many of Western democracies do. And so one of the ways that they kind of bridged the gap was partner with communities, do healthcare kind of trainings for promotoras, right? Health promoters who would go out in the community and talk to people about diabetes, talk about heart conditions, talk about exercise, right? And you deputize an entire army of community to talk to each other, right? You had a lot of indigenous communities in Peru who didn't trust traditional healthcare workers. And by training people from the community, you're able to then bridge that gap and bridge that divide and bring people into the healthcare system and prioritize, right? So I think the promotora model is a perfect example of how you can give power back to community and invest in healthcare and well-being at a community level in a way that amplifies our impact rather than just centers on an institutional understanding of healthcare and well-being. That's part of the problem that we have in the United States. We have institutionalized the hell out of healthcare and well-being.
Yeah.
We've done that with pregnancy, right? Like why we have one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the United States, in the world.
Yeah.
And that's because we got rid of midwives. We got rid of, you know what I mean? And why? Because there were tons of doctors in the 1900s who were coming out of medical school, male doctors, who needed jobs. So we ended up demonizing the midwives as unsanitary witchcraft stuff. And we said, you come to this clean, pristine facility. Well, infections went up through the roof because they didn't have appropriate sanitizing and hygiene practices in hospitals. So we were just killing people left and right through the hospital system. And I can think of many examples in which we've institutionalized the hell out of wellness and well-being when we should kind of be going back to the roots of embedding well-being and wellness in our community.
Yeah, I hated that I dropped that heavy question right at the end, but I think you provided a good answer. And what, again, I'm just sort of summarizing as I'm thinking through our conversation, because similarly to public health and individual wellness, I think it comes back to what we were talking about in the work, where there's sort of program and their systems change. Right. And the thread of everything being rooted in community and community action and agency, and not thinking through systems without the people that it's impacting, which I think is at the crux of the work and the point of many things that we talked about in this conversation. And I think in a moment where we could be very easily driven by fear, there are so many good people in the work that have proximity, that have depth, that have understanding of movement work, systems work, that if we were partnering differently, we perhaps can move our energy from being fear-based and perhaps paralysis to creativity and some of the things that you shared with us as strategies of combating burnout and other elements, right, to keep us both sort of balancing the joy in the work and the things that are not so joyful.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the way we talk about things too is, I think, really matters. Like, I was having a conversation with someone recently about compassion fatigue. And I hate that term because I'm not fatigued from having too much compassion. I'm not fatigued from having a big heart. I'm fatigued because systemically we've structured a system that puts barriers in my ability to do really good work, right? And so that to me, that's why community and partnerships become so critically important, because they can tackle the system in a different way than a single individual can.
Mm-hmm. I love having these podcasts because every time I feel like I'm in some sort of class, and then by the end I have like 1,000 more questions, right? Because I think there's a lot of terms: radical self-care, compassion fatigue. Some of the things that you've been saying are things that we say sort of on the ground in the work, and I'm like, do I agree with this? Do I not agree with this? Like, is there another way to frame it? And I think that the examination of issues, even when they feel comfortable in your own family, your own circumstances, your own organization, it still demands us to be thoughtful on how we're using language and storytelling and making sure that what we mean is what we're doing, and creating space for people to do really good work.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, Pierre, I really appreciate having this opportunity to talk with you. And I am sure you have sparked curiosity on your work and who you are. And if people wanted to learn more about your work and organization, where would they go?
It's just the centerforpublicimpact.org. And of course, folks can find me on LinkedIn under Pierre Berastaín. I think I'm the only one who comes up. So yeah, always happy to connect with like-minded folks, and also those who have a caring, honest challenge to the way that I think about things.
I love that. So an invitation to disagree.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is necessary, right? We can't just roll with people that agree with us.
Yeah. If it comes from a place of love and a place of mutual growth, I welcome it. If it comes from a place of, I just want to prove you that you're wrong and you're wrong, and that I'm right, that doesn't help anybody. That doesn't help anybody grow, right? Yeah. So it's a caveat to the open to challenge. And I tell people, I'm not just a blanket white paper here that is open to any kind of challenge. No, you got to come with the right heart. So
that is fair. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for being on Conversations with Shonda.
If you'd like to explore more content and join our community, find us at conversationswithshonda.com. We have a wonderful collection of episodes featuring notable guests that you can enjoy on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast.